Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 7 of Poll 101 American Government. This week, we're discussing voting fraud in the United States. Now, don't forget, I want you to also discuss the readings, and I have a supplemental lecture that's available in Canvas that goes through some of the main points about, what I think it's important to remember with respect to who votes and why do people vote and is voter turnout in decline. And there's lots of really important information that I want you to be aware of for this week. All of those resources are available in Canvas. But since this week centers around voter participation, I want to take the opportunity to share with you some research that I have done in this area, particularly with respect to voting fraud in the United States. And in particular, what I really want to focus on in today's lecture is talking about Americans' perception about the integrity of our elections in this country. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to start with January 6th. And if you're not too familiar with what happened on that day or, what exactly the events were that led up to that, we're going to discuss that. What happened on January 6th? We're going to talk about the prevalence of voter fraud in the United States. We're also going to discuss public opinion about voting fraud. We're also going to discuss the intersection of conspiracy theories as well as the 2020 presidential election outcomes. And in the context of all of this, we're going to be discussing this through an article that I recently had published called Stopping the Steal and Selling the Big Lie. I've included that article in Canvas for you to review. If you want to read it, that's cool. If you want to talk about it in the discussion board, I'd love that, but it's not required. So just keep that in mind that article is available for you to read in Canvas. So let's talk about the scope of the research that we're going to be talking about in today's lecture. In this article, myself and my co-authors, we primarily center this article around President Donald Trump's reputation as a conspiracy theorist in chief. So we're going to go back many, many years, and we're going to look at all of the different types of conspiracy theories that Donald Trump has perpetuated on social media at one time or another. What's also really central to this article is discussing why there were so many other Republicans in Congress that were willing to spread Donald Trump's claims about a stolen election. So what motivation or incentive did these other members of Congress have to also make these claims about a stolen election? Now, much of our research examines this behavior, this spreading messages about conspiracy theories through politicians' behavior on social media, particularly Twitter. So what we're going to be looking at are the different tweets that members of Congress were posting on social media. And what we also want to look at is whether or not there was a relationship between politicians posting about conspiracy theories with respect to the election on Twitter and whether or not that was related to their behavior on January 6th. In other words, did members of Congress who posted a lot of election fraud conspiracy theory rhetoric, were they more likely to end up wanting to reject election results on January 6th or not? And then we're going to wrap up with a conversation about what this case study tells us about the rational actions and strategic behaviors of elected officials and whether or not this is going to be a pattern that we will see repeated in future elections. And what does that mean for the state of our democracy as well as people's faith in their own democracy? So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So very briefly, let's just talk about the series of events leading up to the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. To put the election into context, Trump loses the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden by about 38 electoral votes and somewhere around 7 million votes in total. Now, on December 19th, President Trump announced that he was going to be hosting a rally on January 6th, approximately a mile and a half away from the United States Capitol. Now, keep in mind the date of January 6th is significant. That was the date that Congress met to certify the election results from each state. And generally, this is just a formality. Technically, by the time we get to this stage where Congress is certifying the election results, states have already gone through the certification process on their own. So generally, there's nothing particularly memorable about when Congress meets to certify election results. And during Trump's rally on January 6th, when Congress is getting ready to convene and certify the election results, the president, as well as several of his invited guests, make multiple unsubstantiated election fraud claims. And you may recall during this event, Trump repeatedly makes this claim: we have to fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So, following the rally, thousands of Trump supporters marched to the Capitol. Around 1 p.m., they breached security barriers, overwhelmed law enforcement, and forced their way into the Capitol building. Once inside the Capitol, rioters vandalized offices, broke windows, and clashed with police. The building was put on lockdown, and lawmakers, staff, and journalists were evacuated or sheltered in place. 5 people died as a result of the day's events, including 1 Capitol police officer. And again, all of this was predicated on Trump's repeated claims that the election was rigged and that fraudulent voting was rampant in 2020. So much so that it changed the outcome of the election. And here's where I want to start with our first stop and think for today's lecture. If you had to guess, among recent presidential contests in the United States, approximately what percentage of votes would you say are fraudulently cast? And whether this is intentional or unintentional, I just want you to think about how big of a problem do you think voter fraud is in the United States? Do you think that it's so minimal that it's insignificant? Do you think that, yeah, it happens, but probably not to the degree that it could change the outcome of an election? Or do you think that voter fraud in this country is a serious problem? Take a moment to pause, reflect on this prompt, and then we'll jump right into it. So I want to share some comprehensive studies that have examined this question precisely. How common is voter fraud in the United States? A 2014 study found 31 credible instances of voter impersonation fraud from 2000 to 2014. Keep in mind, that's out of more than 1 billion ballots. So this is often cited as one of the most comprehensive studies. It only found 31 credible instances. There was a review of the 2016 election that found 4 documented cases of voter fraud out of the 136 million ballots that were cast. So that's far less than even 1%. And most of such cases involve spouses submitting absentee ballots for their deceased partners. It's quite sad, but many times you will surprisingly hear people say things like, just before I die, I want to make sure that I'm able to cast my ballot for so-and-so. In fact, I just saw an article the other day about how Jimmy Carter, our former president, is just hanging on so he can vote for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. So this happens more frequently than you think. And this actually leads to the conspiracy theory that dead people are voting, because after audits are conducted, we will find that the names of individuals who are deceased actually voted in a presidential election. And we ask ourselves, how did this happen? Well, generally, it's exactly this. It's, little old ladies who request an absentee ballot for their partner. They die before the election and they cast that ballot as, their partner's last wish. So again, this is very much an example of voter fraud, but it is also unintentional. It is done without the intent of being fraudulent. It doesn't necessarily excuse the case that it is voter fraud, but it is not this nefarious kind of like systematic attempt to subvert the democratic process and change the outcome of an election, right? But what about voter fraud in 2020? Now, I want to take you to the Heritage Foundation's website that catalogs all these different cases of voter fraud. You may have heard of the Heritage Foundation. They've recently been receiving a lot of media attention. this election cycle due to kind of being the main force behind this ultra-radical Project 2025 that you may have heard of, which just in short, the whole purpose of this Project 25 is this executive plan that it kind of essentially works to dismantle the federal government and the bureaucracy. We're not going to get into that in this lecture, but what I want to emphasize is that the Heritage Foundation is known as being one of the more conservative think tanks in the United States, and even by their estimates, even by the most conservative estimates, they report that there have been a total of 1,546 proven instances of voter fraud that occurred in the 2020 election. And you would think to yourself, wow, that seems a lot more than, like the 31 proven instances in that big comprehensive report that we talked about. That's a huge spike. And yes, you would be right. That is a big jump from previous studies, but also I want you to keep in mind that that's still less than 1% of the more than 159 million ballots that were cast in 2020. So it's not to say that we shouldn't ignore these statistics or that voter fraud isn't a problem in this country, but consistently, right? No study, regardless of whether we're talking about a liberal think tank or a conservative think tank, there is no systematic, widespread fraud. We have no evidence for that. In fact, the individual who was encouraging voter fraud the most was actually President Donald Trump while he was on the campaign trail in 2020. You may recall that there was this moment during a North Carolina rally where Donald Trump was speaking with voters and he said, have you voted by mail? Don't vote by mail. You can't trust vote by mail. If you've already voted by mail, you need to make sure that on election day you go vote in person. And that's illegal. Voting twice is absolutely illegal. So I guess that's just a bit ironic. Regardless, as we've looked at here, some of the most comprehensive studies on voter fraud suggest that these incidents occur less than 1% of the time. In fact, if we look at this quote from The Truth About Voter Fraud, which I believe is from the Brennan Center, which is a liberal-leaning think tank, they say, "It is more likely that an American will be struck by lightning than that he will impersonate another voter at the polls." Again, despite this overwhelming evidence that voter fraud does not happen that often, nor does it happen on such a system-level scale that it would change the outcome of an election, we find that Americans are increasingly believing that election fraud is rampant in this country. Since November 2020, public opinion polls have consistently shown that approximately 1/3 of voting-age Americans believe that widespread voter fraud exists in American elections. And that's insane, right? Like 33% of Americans believing that our elections are fraudulent. Again, how can a democracy survive when 1/3 of Americans don't have faith in the democratic process, in voting? What's even more frightening is when we disaggregate this data by partisanship. Nearly 50% of Republicans who were surveyed in 2020 believe that there is a great deal of fraud in American elections. That's staggering. 39% of independents believe the same thing, and about 22% of Democrats believe that there's a great deal of fraud in American elections. And let's just look at what happens on the other side of the graph. Among individuals who report that they believe that hardly any fraud occurs in elections, while only about 36% of Democrats agreed with that statement, 17% of independents, and only 11% of Republicans believe that there's hardly any fraud. And so a question that I want to posit here is, despite voter fraud being exceptionally rare, why do so many Americans believe in such claims? And here's where I want to start introducing, again, the power of conspiracy theories and fear messaging and just the overall political landscape that encourages such beliefs. So first, I think we really have to understand the impact that COVID-19 had on our collective psyche. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we have really been operating in a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Second, states varied wildly and kind of radically changed their voting procedures in 2020 to accommodate the COVID-19 pandemic and the public health crisis that it presented to voters. And then third, many trusted politicians were at the center of this misinformation dissemination. So when we consider all three of these factors together, it's not surprising that a third of Americans lack trust in our election processes. And let's dig down on these in a little bit more detail. So a couple weeks ago when we were talking about public opinion, we already know that 9 in 10 Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory, which is rather shocking. Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? Well, we've already talked about this, how conspiratorial rhetoric appeals to our epistemic needs, our existential needs, our social needs. And I want to illustrate how election fraud conspiracy rhetoric particularly appeals to these various psychological needs. When we think about the mounting political polarization that occurs in this country, the radical change in voting procedures that essentially happened overnight across the 50 states in 2020, and add on top of that a global pandemic, it created the perfect recipe for conspiracy theories. Our psychological needs were frustrated, the environment was rife with uncertainty, security and personal freedom felt lost, and isolation wreaked havoc on our identity and our self-purpose, making us incredibly vulnerable to these fear-based messages about not being able to trust the government or not being able to trust the election outcome. And in the civil rights lecture, I think we spent some time talking about how we're kind of backsliding in this country with respect to, are we making it easier or making it more difficult to vote in this country? One of the reasons why we see such an increase in restrictive voting measures being passed in the last few years is because we made it really, really easy to vote in 2020. And I just want to share a little bit about what were some of these new voting procedures that happened in 2020 and why did that cause such a backlash. So in 2020, we expanded eligibility for absentee or mail voting. We offered online ballot request systems to request absentee ballots. A lot of people were concerned that just anyone could go online and request a ballot, and there was no real, way to check who was requesting this ballot, and that anybody could fill that out, and there was all this opportunity for fraud. States provided prepaid postage for mail ballots, so again, while we would say that, oh, this is good, the state is sending you a ballot, you don't even have to pay for postage, just put it in your mailbox. Again, people were concerned about the opportunity for fraudulent behavior here. Many states had 24-hour drop box locations to submit your absentee ballots. Again, people were concerned with things like ballot harvesting and that these drop box locations didn't have 24-hour security, so there were concerns there. And then I think one of the biggest ones was the extended deadline for postmarked ballots to be counted after Election Day, that many people were concerned about. That was fundamentally unfair, that if you didn't submit your ballot by Election Day, your vote shouldn't count, and all kinds of issues like that. So these were just a handful of changes that were made to 2020 that had a lot of people worried about, whether or not we had the appropriate safeguards in place to protect the integrity of the election in 2020. And we can just look here, right? This graphic is just a snapshot of showing us all the different states that require various types of documented excusals in order to obtain an absentee ballot. And, essentially with all the rule changes that happened in 2020, these were all kind of erased, all of these different requirements. And so I want to emphasize that the concern behind whether or not our elections were secure were valid. Many changes were made. The security concerns were legitimate. This was not a completely unfounded concern that opponents were levying. But I want to emphasize again, right, when we make it harder to vote, that has a negative impact on turnout. And when we make it easier to vote, that has a positive impact on turnout. And I just want to share the example of Louisiana. Now, for their July primary, only 14% of eligible voters turned out on election day. It was abysmal. And that's because Louisiana didn't authorize mail ballots for the primary, despite COVID-related concerns. They said, if you want to vote, you're going to have to come out in public and cast your ballot in person. To which many people responded, hey, there's a global pandemic that's killing millions of people. I'm good. And this is the ramification, right, of not expanding voter protections and voter access in the middle of a global pandemic. Next, I want to talk about the role that Donald Trump played in promoting these election fraud conspiracy theories. So, of course, Donald Trump was the individual who spearheaded these election fraud conspiracy theories. He's often jokingly been referred to as the conspiracy theorist in chief. And I think what happened here is that many Republicans, many other party members, saw an opportunity to signal their loyalty to the president by also co-opting the president's messaging tactics. And this is not something new with respect to Donald Trump's behavior and the way that he likes to message. We can go back to 2012, where Donald Trump has frequently taken credit for being the one who started the birther conspiracy theory with respect to President Barack Obama, the idea that he's not even an American citizen, that he was born in Kenya, therefore, under Article 2 of the United States Constitution, he's not even qualified to run for president. So Donald Trump often takes credit for beginning that conspiracy theory. There was the time that Trump claimed that thousands of New Jersey Muslims were out celebrating in the streets while 9/11 was happening. There was that other time that Trump accused Ted Cruz's father of helping JFK's assassin. And there's many, many more that we could talk about. But I want to keep in mind that as early as 2016, when Donald Trump was facing Hillary Clinton in the presidential contest, he began piloting this election fraud conspiracy theory in the weeks leading up to that election. So here we see this tweet where Trump says, of course there's large-scale voter fraud happening on and before Election Day. Why do Republican leaders deny what is going on? So naive. This is October 17th, 2016. And it's almost identical to a tweet that we see a month after the election in 2020. The United States had more votes than it had people voting by a lot. This travesty cannot be allowed to stand. It was a rigged election, one not even fit for third world countries. And I want to take a moment to actually talk about this one in particular because it's something that we see Trump frequently say, especially when he's talking about state level elections. He'll say things like, I looked at the voter turnout rolls and, across precincts in Minnesota or Wisconsin, you'll see things like 130% voter turnout. How is that even possible? That's more people voting than voters by a lot. And what Trump fails to realize here is that, these places have same day voter registration. So at the beginning of the day, before anyone is voted, they print out the number of registered voters. And if people come and register throughout the day, then that number is going to increase. And so you'll end up with things like 130% of registered voters voted today, meaning that, there was a 30% increase in registered voters in that precinct. So at any rate, I'll see a lot of people, not only Trump and politicians, but also just voters in general will repeat these claims. So I think it's worth breaking down why we do see that on official government documents that more people voted than those who were registered, because same-day voter registration explains that. Right, next I want to start focusing on the tweets and the rhetoric and the messaging that was used to start planting these seeds of doubt among the American public. So here, let's look at this one from Donald Trump on Twitter, of course, before he was banned from Twitter. He says, "Last night I was leading, often solidly in many key states, in almost all instances Democrat run and controlled. Then, one by one, they started to magically disappear as surprise ballot dumps were counted. Very strange, and the pollsters got it completely and historically wrong." So there's a few things to break down here. First, we know that Democratic voters generally tend to vote by mail, and they have historically done so. They tend to vote by mail or vote absentee much more than do Republican voters. And there's basically, I think socioeconomics explain this pattern best. If voting is important to you and you're of low socioeconomic status and you don't know if you're going to be able to take off work to go vote on election day, or if you're going to have reliable transportation, one of the easiest things that you can do is request an absentee ballot or vote early to make sure that your vote is cast. Generally, Republicans tend to be wealthier, of higher socioeconomic status, and they're much more likely to vote on election day. And second, when states start counting ballots, they count the ballots that were counted in person first. Which means that if we're talking about a state that tends to vote for Democrats, when we start counting those ballots that were cast in person, there's going to be a really big Republican lead on those ballots, because we know that Republicans are most likely to vote in person. Now, because of the way that election rules are set up, the absentee ballots and the mail ballots, right, those are all counted later. And that's where this surprise ballot dump message is coming from, that, very suspiciously and very strangely, all of these secret Democrat ballots started coming in. But there's a logical explanation for that, because we know that Democrats are more likely to vote absentee, they're more likely to vote by mail, and that those ballots are counted later. But regardless, the message aligns with what we all saw unfold during the counting of the 2020 ballots, that it very much did look like there were these surprise ballot dumps that all happened to be overwhelmingly Democratic votes. So what I want you taking away here is that there are these kernels of truth, right? Like, technically, what Trump is saying happened. I mean, it did appear to happen that way, but it, again, wasn't out of some nefarious, concerted effort against him. It was we as political scientists very much expected that this is exactly how the voter rolls would turn out, because we know how Democrats vote and we know how Republicans vote. And so let's start with the very first research question that we have in this article. To what extent did House Republicans promote Trump's election fraud conspiracy theories? So let me tell you a little bit about how we went about collecting all of the data for this research project. So like I said earlier, we conducted a content analysis on all of the tweets that Republican members of Congress had made with respect to election fraud denialism. So we collected tweets from all House Republicans from Election Day, which was November 3rd, to Certification Day, which was January 6th. In our data set, that gave us a total of 20,651 tweets. We had a total of 209 members of Congress. That's what MCs stand for. And when we analyzed the content of these tweets, we came across a really shocking statistic. Nearly 70% made at least one conspiratorial tweet. That's 145 Republican members of Congress. So again, trying to understand, how is it that a third of Americans don't have faith in American elections? Well, look at the magnitude by which we see our elected officials parroting the same message. And so what I want to share is some of the key words that we searched for when looking through these tweets to see if they were appealing to various conspiracy theories about the election. And so keep in mind, politicians tweet a lot. So when we're looking at the frequency here and we see things like, fraud was mentioned 1.64% of the time, that's still pretty significant, right? That's a total of 339 tweets. But within the universe of tweets that we see in this time frame, that's why it registers as such a small percentage, because there were just so many tweets that we had to sift through. So fraud, not surprisingly, was the most common word that we saw mentioned among these members' tweets. Election integrity was the second most common. Then the commitment to object to the certification of election results on January 6th was the third most common. And then we see lots of other little keywords here, like making the distinction between we're going to count the legal votes but not count the illegal votes, and there's like a lot of coding and dog whistling going in there as well. Mentions about the irregularities of the election, making a commitment to protect fair and free or free and fair election, some variation of that messaging. Unfortunately, Stop the Steal was not as powerful as a rallying cry hashtag that I thought it would be. Only about 68 members of Congress actually used the Stop the Steal hashtag. We also included mentions of the word parler to identify tweets and accounts that may be more prone to promoting conspiracy theories. If you're familiar, Parler was this microblogging social media platform that I think launched in 2018, and it quickly gained a lot of attention for its preference for absolutist free speech and complete lack of moderation. You could pretty much say whatever you wanted on Parler. And this platform became a hotbed for election fraud conspiracy theories. It was a hub for white supremacist ideation, Holocaust denial, anti-vax rhetoric, all kinds of stuff. So we included a mention for Parler in our data. Dominion refers to the Dominion voting machines that were alleged to have recast ballots or deleted votes. We include the word tampering with respect to individuals harvesting ballots or tampering with ballots. And then classically, we have our mentions of dead people voting. There were 5 total tweets that had suggested that dead people had voted in the 2020 election. And I'm just going to show some examples of these tweets. I'm not going to read each of them off, but I just want to illustrate how, different examples of the tweets that we came across, how they appeal to epistemic needs, how they explain a confusing political landscape. Generally, this was done through questions such as, why is the counting of the ballots? Why is it taking so long? There must be something nefarious going on here. We can look at how politicians message to appeal to existential needs. How do we know that the changes to the voting are safe and secure? All of this makes me feel highly out of control. And then finally, appeals to social needs. This idea that as Americans, our identity and our values are under attack. The Republican Party, our identity, our country is under siege and it must be protected. Kind of like this rallying cry to drum up collective support. Right, so these are just a few examples of the actual tweets that were in our data set that were appealing to or catering to election denialism. So the big thing that we wanted to identify in our first research question was how prevalent was this messaging and what were the types of messages that politicians were using. And so the big takeaway from the part 1 is that, wow, 70% of Republicans in the House of Representatives made at least one tweet about, some type of election fraud conspiracy theory. That's really powerful. That brings us to question 2. Can we model with data which House Republicans were most likely to spread election fraud conspiracy theories on Twitter? And so here we had some key predictor variables that we wanted to look at. Was the member of Congress representing Arizona or Pennsylvania? So keep in mind, on January 6th, these were the 2 states where there was significant momentum to reject the certification of election votes in Arizona and Pennsylvania. So we wanted to see whether or not members representing those states in particular were more or less likely to promote election fraud conspiracy theories on Twitter. We also wanted to look at whether or not the member to Congress was newly elected. Again, we suspected that people who were brand new to Congress, they might be most willing to engage in conspiracy theory rhetoric because they really want to signal to the president, look at how loyal I am to you. You think the election was stolen, I'm going to stand behind you. Kind of counter to that, we also wanted to look at whether or not the member held any type of congressional leadership position. So generally, if you have a significant leadership position in Congress, that generally means that you've been around for a while, and we can kind of consider this to be a proxy for being in the establishment, right? Being in the old guard. And we suspected that maybe if you've been around for a while, if you've been in politics longer than Trump has, you might be less persuaded to engage in this conspiracy theory rhetoric because you already have a pretty strong reputation in the institution. Another thing that we wanted to look at, or that we hypothesized, is that individuals who represented districts where Trump won by a landslide, maybe they would be more likely to also engage in this conspiracy theory rhetoric because, they would say to themselves, well, look at how well Trump did in my district. He won with 80% of the vote. There's no way he lost the country, right? And then finally, the last thing that we wanted to look at was this change in vote share in these members' districts. So did Trump earn a smaller vote share compared to 2016 in a member's particular district? I have some graphs that will help this make more sense, but the idea being that, say that you're a member of the House of Representatives, and let's just say that you represent Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district, right? And, maybe it's the case that Trump won by like a landslide in 2016, but all of a sudden in 2020, Trump didn't do so hot. You, as the member of that district, might say, hold on, I think that there's something fraudulent going on here. How did Trump do so well in 2016, but so badly in 2020? Something seems off to me. It's not possible that he became less popular. I think that fraud happened. So these are our 5 different hypotheses that we have for this research question. And let's break down our results. And so just to be clear, you're not going to be tested on the multivariate regression tables or things that you're going to see in this lecture. I just kind of want to introduce you to this kind of stuff. This is the type of data analysis that we do in the social sciences. It's okay if you don't understand coefficients or standard errors or anything like that. I just want to show you what we found. Basically, we had a lot of confidence in 3 of our hypotheses, and those are the ones that are highlighted here. So first, we see a negative relationship here with our leadership variable and our conspiracy theory tweets variable. And basically what this means is that if you held a leadership position in the United States House of Representatives, you were less likely to post conspiracy theories about the election on Twitter. And that makes sense, at least in terms of how we expected that relationship to go. Next, we looked at Trump's margin of victory in conspiracy tweets. We found a positive relationship there. So what this is telling us is that as Trump's margin of victory increased in your district, the likelihood that you posted conspiracy theory tweets also increased. And then lastly, we have a negative relationship with our Trump vote share change and our conspiracy theory tweets. And this one's a little tricky to interpret, but it essentially goes in the direction that we expected it to. If Trump did worse in your district in 2020 compared to 2016, you were more likely to post conspiracy theory tweets on your social media. So altogether, these were the 3 big factors that we found to be most associated with whether or not you would be a member of Congress who was going to engage in election fraud conspiracy theories on Twitter. Next, we have research question 3. Now, this is our last one. We wanted to look at whether or not House Republicans who shared election fraud conspiracy theories on Twitter, were they also more likely to object to the certification of election results on January 6th? So we've got this cool map here that kind of illustrates our dependent variable, right? It's the main thing that we're interested in studying. And this is vote outcome on January 6th. So all the states here that you see in red, these are House Republicans who objected to both Arizona and Pennsylvania. Again, Arizona and Pennsylvania, because those were the only two states where there were enough votes to question whether we should reject or certify the election results in those two states. And there's a couple reasons why the effort went specifically onto Arizona and Pennsylvania in particular. In case you're curious, for the last several presidential cycles, Arizona has slowly been slipping away from Republican dominance. So it makes sense that if Republicans were going to object to the certification of any of these states, it would certainly be Arizona, that they really want to keep Arizona voting red, keeping in mind that Arizona has 11 electoral votes. And then Pennsylvania was another strategic move. Democrats have slowly been losing Pennsylvania. It's increasingly been going in Republicans' favor. However, that was not the case in 2020. As you can see in this graphic here, Democrats won Pennsylvania by a super narrow margin of error, about 1.17 percentage points. And Pennsylvania has 19 electoral votes. So I just wanted to provide some brief context on, why Arizona, why Pennsylvania. I think these are the strategic considerations underlying that decision here. But back to the graph here, this is essentially what we're trying to predict. We're trying to predict members of Congress's voting behavior on January 6th. So red here represents, like I said earlier, Republicans who wanted to object to both Arizona and Pennsylvania. Not surprising that we see most of that activity happening in the Deep South and some of our more conservative areas in the West and the Midwest. We have the Democratic districts, right? So all of these districts that you see in blue are represented by Democrats. Of course, they all voted to certify the election results because Joe Biden had won. When we look at these purple districts, those are our split votes. So we found some instances where Republicans wanted to perhaps certify Arizona but reject Pennsylvania, or vice versa. So we thought that maybe there was some strategic behavior going on there. And then when we look at the red vertical slanted districts, those are the rare amount of Republicans who voted to certify both Arizona and Pennsylvania. And we used many of the same variables that predicted whether or not you would tweet about election fraud conspiracy theories to also be predictive of your voting behavior on January 6th. So here's that table here. Again, I don't expect you to know what multinomial logistic regression is or to understand these coefficients. It looks super complicated. So let's just go directly to the graphs, which I think would be much better for everybody else. These are the biggest significant findings that we had in our research. So first, let's look at the percentage of conspiratorial tweets that a member of Congress had and whether or not that was predictive of their voting behavior on January 6th. So here's the big takeaway. The more you tweeted about the election being stolen, the more likely you were to object to the certification of election results. Boom. Not surprising at all. I think that that's an exam question. I think that I do ask you just a couple questions about this study on the exam. And that one's pretty straightforward and it's common sense, right? The more you tweet about the election being stolen, the more likely you were to object to the certification results on January 6th. And we see that plain as day in this graphic here. Next, we wanted to look at Trump's margin of victory in 2020 and how that influenced members of Congress's vote on January 6th. Again, not really surprising looking at this red line here. And again, these results are pretty intuitive. When we look at the x-axis right here, what we're looking at is Trump's margin of victory. And so that could have ranged anywhere from -10 to 60. And so what we find is that as we increase Trump's margin of victory from -10 all the way up to 60, what happens? The probability that you object to both Arizona and Pennsylvania strongly increases the better that Trump does in your district. And again, this feeds into the mentality that, like, hey, Trump won my district by 60 points. There's no way in hell that he lost the election, right? So it feeds into this kind of like myopic narrative that he did well in my districts. The fact that he lost must mean that the whole system is rigged. So we find evidence for that here. And then finally, this vote share change variable. Again, did Trump do worse in 2020 compared to his performance in 2016 in a particular district? I just want to call your attention to this red line here. In those districts where Trump did much worse with voters in 2020 compared to 2016, those members of Congress were much more likely to think that something fishy was going on, and they were much more likely to object to the certification of election results. Again, having this very narrow view of, well, there's no way that Trump became less popular in my district. That just doesn't make sense. So the only thing that can explain this away is a conspiracy theory. And so that was a lot of data. This is a pretty big research project. It's totally okay if there were some things that went over your head. I just kind of wanted to introduce you to this type of work, this type of research. This is the stuff that we do in political science. If this kind of stuff interests you, this is the skills that I teach students in our research methods class. So you can take on a project just like this, learn how to do data analysis and methods, all kinds of really cool stuff. So I hope you enjoyed. Again, if you have any questions, please leave those in the discussion board, and I'm happy to explain in detail any questions you might have had about the study or our methodology or anything like that. But in conclusion, what we find in our research is that January 6th is predominantly seen as a Trump loyalty test. The vote against the certification of election results in Arizona and Pennsylvania was largely driven by three main factors. One, Trump's vast margin of victory in conservative districts. Two, the promotion of election fraud conspiracy theories on Twitter. And then three, new Republican members of Congress were much more eager to align with Trump. I think I actually skipped over that graphic. I'll show it here. Here we're looking at the difference between members of Congress who have served multiple terms versus our brand new members of Congress. And essentially what we see here is that among freshman members of Congress, the most common thing that they did on January 6th was objected to both Arizona and Pennsylvania. Now, because the confidence intervals of these two overlap, it doesn't mean that we can say that freshman members were more likely than multi-term members to object, but we can very confidently say that they were among freshman members, they were significantly more likely to object, which is a very intriguing finding. And so lastly, that brings us to our final thoughts. What are your thoughts about this research project? Do you have any questions? If so, feel free to email me those or post them in the discussion board. I'm eager to see what you guys have to say. Did the information presented in this lecture influence your opinions at all about voting fraud in the United States? When we began this lecture, did you think that voting fraud was more prevalent than otherwise suggested by some of the data that we analyzed in today's lecture? Do you think that this rhetoric will reemerge in the 2024 presidential contest? I mean, we've already seen a bit of it. I mean, Trump likes to make this claim. Again, he's been making it since 2016. If I lose in 2024, it's because of fraud. So how prevalent do you think this rhetoric will continue to be in the 2024 race? What are the ramifications of this type of political messaging? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what other ways this type of messaging might negatively impact impact voters? And then finally, how can we hold our political officials accountable when they make false claims about the election results? So these are just a few ideas that I'd like to see you guys explore in the discussion board. I think there's lots of interesting stuff to talk about. Can't wait to see what you guys have to say. At any rate, that's all I have for you guys today. I really hope you enjoyed. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.